The morning I almost signed away 35 years of my life, I was standing in my own kitchen wearing my dead husband's apron, and the offer came by phone from a calm, professional voice attached to a number large enough that my hand went completely still on the counter. And he said his firm specialized in acquiring legacy family restaurants, places with history, with character, places worth preserving. And he said he made it sound so much like kindness that I had to sit down on the stool by the prep station, the same stool Gerald used to sit on when he was reading the morning invoices. And I was 67 years old, and I had been running this kitchen alone for 4 years. And 4 years does not sound like a long time until you understand that every single one of those 1,460 mornings I reached for his coffee mug before remembering, and every single one of those mornings the remembering hit like the first time all over again, like something with weight and edges. And I was tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with doing alone what was never meant to be done alone. So when this voice offered me enough money to retire quietly and never look at another breakfast rush again, I held the phone against my chest, and I actually considered it for 30 full seconds. And then something made me ask for the name of the lead investor. And the voice said the offer was coming through a holding company represented by a Mr. Raymond Caldwell. And the stool I was sitting on had belonged to Gerald, and the apron I was wearing had belonged to Gerald too, because Raymond was Gerald's baby brother, the man who had wept loudly in the front pew at the funeral, the man I had fed Sunday breakfast for 4 straight years, because Gerald always said Raymond was family, and family meant the door was always open. And what I did not know, standing in that kitchen holding that phone, was that Raymond had spent 8 of those months sitting inside my trust like a man who already knew exactly which door he was going to walk out of and what he was going to carry when he left. If you have ever let someone close to you because someone you loved vouched for them and later discovered that the vouching was the whole plan, comment Gerald's name right now, because what I found out next did not just change everything I knew about Raymond, it changed everything I understood about the 4 years I thought I had spent grieving, and the 1 year before that when Gerald was still here and already quietly building something I had no idea existed. My name is Dorothy. I am 67 years old. Gerald and I opened this diner with $11,000 and a borrowed commercial oven 35 years ago. We burned the first batch of biscuits so badly the smoke alarm went off, and Gerald laughed so hard he had to sit down on the kitchen floor, and I stood there, covered in flour, laughing with him. And we were broke, and we were happy, and we were exactly where we were supposed to be. And Raymond knew all of that. He knew exactly what this place meant, and he knew exactly what he was trying to take. And what he did not know was what Gerald had spent 2 years quietly building to stop him, long before either of us understood there was anything to stop. Gerald and I found the building on a Tuesday in April 1989, and it was in genuinely terrible shape. Cracked tiles, a leaking roof, a kitchen that smelled like 40 years of bad decisions. And we stood in that empty dining room in our good coats because we had dressed up to see it the way you dressed up for something that matters. And we looked at each other and we both saw exactly the same thing at exactly the same moment. And neither of us said a word for almost a full minute because some things do not need words. They just need 2 people standing in the same room, feeling the same pull at the same time. And we signed the lease 3 days later with money we had saved across 5 years of double shifts and skipped vacations and every small no we said to everything that was not this. And Gerald painted the walls himself, I sewed the curtains, we argued about the name for 2 weeks, and finally Gerald said, a place that feeds people should feel like it belongs to the neighborhood, and we called it Caldwell's Corner. and I want you to understand what that name meant, because it matters to everything that comes later. It was not named after Gerald, it was not named after Raymond, it was not named after the Caldwell family as some kind of inheritance or legacy or claim. It was named after the corner of Delaney and Fifth, where we had eaten our first real date meal at a diner that no longer exists, and Caldwell was simply who we were when we chose that corner. And if you have ever built something from nothing with someone you loved and poured so much of yourself into it that the building stopped being a building and started being a record of every sacrifice you ever made together, then you already understand why no amount of money was ever going to make that phone offer feel like anything else than what it actually was. And for 31 years, Gerald and I ran that kitchen together. He handled the front of house, I handled the recipes. We argued about the menu every season and agreed on everything that actually mattered. We raised our daughter Sarah there. She did homework at the corner table. She learned to count change at the register. She grew up understanding that work was not something separate from love, but was in fact one of the most honest ways love ever showed itself. And then, 4 years ago, on a Sunday morning during the breakfast rush, Gerald sat down and did not get back up, and the biscuits were still in the oven, and I stood there for 3 full seconds not knowing whether to pull them out or let them burn. And I pulled them out because Gerald would have pulled them out, and I finished that service because Gerald would have finished that service, and I cried in the walk-in freezer between the morning and lunch rush where no one could hear me. And if you have ever kept moving, not because you were strong, but because stopping felt like the final betrayal of someone who never once stopped for you, drop the word moving in the comments. Because grief does not make you strong, it just makes you understand that sometimes love means pulling the biscuits out of the oven even when your whole world has just ended on the other side of the kitchen door.
Raymond started coming around 3 months after the funeral. And I want to be precise about this because the timing matters more than I understood then. He did not come immediately. He waited exactly long enough for the shock to soften and the loneliness to settle in. And then he appeared at my back door on a Saturday morning with coffee from the place down the street. And that particular combination of patience and timing is something I have thought about many times since. Because a person who arrives in your rawest moment feels like rescue, but a person who waits until you are raw enough to need rescuing and then arrives is something else entirely. And I did not know the difference then because I was tired and I was grieving, and Gerald had always said Raymond needed looking after more than he let on. So I believed that, and I made him coffee, and I showed him around, and I introduced him to my suppliers, and within 4 months he had a key to the back door. And I told myself it was practical, because deliveries sometimes came early and I could not always be there, and Raymond lived close, and it made sense. And that is the thing about a slow and deliberate takeover. Every single step makes complete sense in isolation. It is only when you stand back far enough to see all the steps together that you realize they were never isolated at all. They were always a staircase, and someone else had always known where it led. And by month 6, Raymond was handling my supplier calls. And when my head baker Connie pulled me aside one morning and told me quietly that Raymond had switched our flour order to a cheaper supplier without telling her, and the biscuits were not the same, I confronted him that evening. And he smiled the way people smile when they have already decided your objection is temporary. And he said he was just trying to help with the margins. And then he said Gerald always worried about the margins. And I went quiet, because that is what I always did when Raymond used Gerald's name. He used it like a key. Every single time I pushed back, he would unlock something with Gerald's name, and I would go silent. Because what do you say to a dead man's words coming out of a living man's mouth? And if someone has ever used a person you loved and lost as a weapon against your own judgment, comment "used his name," because that specific betrayal lives in a place in your chest that does not have a clean word for it, but everyone who has felt it knows exactly where that place is. And then, one Thursday afternoon, Raymond arrived with a folder and a relaxed smile and said there was routine paperwork that needed updating, a liability insurance restructuring, he said, completely standard for a business of this size. He said his contact had already prepared everything. And I sat at the table by the window where Gerald used to drink his second coffee, and I read the first 2 pages, and they looked exactly like what he said they were, and I signed. And I should tell you that I had called my own attorney the week before about something unrelated and had meant to mention the insurance paperwork to her, but Raymond had said it was time-sensitive and needed to be done before Friday, and I told myself I would follow up with her the following week, and I did not. And that 1 week of delay, that one small postponement, is the thing Raymond was counting on most of all.
Sarah called from Chicago 4 days after I signed the paperwork, and I want to tell you that she did not call because she suspected anything. She called because she calls every Thursday evening without fail. She has done it since she moved away 11 years ago, and something in my voice that Thursday must have shifted in a way I was not aware of, because she went quiet mid-conversation and asked me carefully how things were going at the diner. Not the general "how are things going" she asks every week, but a specific, careful version of that question with a particular stillness behind it. The kind of stillness that means she is already listening for something I have not said yet. And I mentioned the insurance paperwork the way you mention something ordinary, and she asked me in a very measured voice if I still had the documents, and I said yes, and she said, "Do not touch them, I am coming this weekend." And she drove from Chicago that Friday without calling Raymond, without telling anyone except me, and when she walked through my front door with her briefcase and that expression Gerald always called her courthouse face, I felt something shift in my chest I had not felt in 4 years, which was the specific feeling of not being alone in something that had been quietly terrifying me. And if someone has ever shown up for you without being asked, without making it about themselves, without needing you to explain the whole thing before they decided you were worth showing up for, comment "just showed up," because that kind of love is not loud. It does not announce itself. It simply appears with a briefcase and rolls up its sleeves. And Sarah sat at my kitchen table that Friday night and went through every document I had signed in 8 months, supplier contracts, schedule changes, the insurance forms, everything. And she read the way Gerald used to read contracts, slowly and carefully, going back to reread the sentences that did not set right. And at 11:30 that night, she closed the last folder and looked up and said, "Mom, I need you to listen carefully." And what she explained to me then was that the document Raymond had brought was not a liability insurance update. It was a limited partnership agreement, and by signing it, I had unknowingly made Raymond a 20% co-owner of Caldwell's Corner, with a clause allowing him to increase his stake through a future buyout option at a price he had locked in 18 months earlier, before the diner had increased in value significantly. Meaning the anonymous phone offer I had received was Raymond attempting to execute that option. He was not coming in with outside money. He was using a document I had already signed to acquire the diner at a price he had quietly fixed before it was worth what it was worth now. And Sarah looked at me across the table, and I looked at her, and the kitchen was completely silent. And she said, "This is fraud, Mom, and we are going to prove it. But I need you to understand that proving it is going to take time, and it is going to take the right people, and it is not going to happen overnight. And if someone has ever sat across a table from someone you trust completely and heard them say something that rearranged everything you thought you understood about the past year of your life, comment "rearranged," because there is a specific kind of shock that is not loud. It does not arrive with panic. It arrives with a terrible, quiet clarity. And that is exactly what settled over my kitchen table that Friday night, while Sarah was already reaching for her phone to make the first call.
Sarah spent that entire Saturday on the phone, and I want you to understand what that looked like, because it did not look like the dramatic movie version of someone fighting for justice. It looked like a woman sitting at my kitchen table for 11 straight hours, with 3 legal pads and a cold cup of coffee, calling people calmly and methodically, and taking very precise notes. And the first person she reached was my own attorney, Carol Reeves, who I had failed to call back the week before about the insurance paperwork. And when Sarah explained what I had signed, Carol went quiet for a long moment, and then said, "Bring me everything Monday morning." And the second person Sarah contacted was Gerald's personal attorney, a man named Walter Briggs, who had handled Gerald's estate, and who Sarah had found in Gerald's old files. And Walter did not go quiet when Sarah explained the situation. Walter said something that stopped Sarah mid-sentence, because he said, "There is something in Gerald's file I think you need to see." And he would not say more than that over the phone. And when we walked into Walter's office that Monday morning, he stood up from behind his desk and set a sealed envelope on the table between us, and explained that Gerald had left it with him approximately 2 years before he died, with specific written instructions that it was only to be opened if Dorothy ever faced a legal challenge to her ownership of Caldwell's Corner, or if any member of the Caldwell family, including Raymond, specifically by name, had any moral or legal claim to any portion of the business. And Walter said, in 24 years of practice, he had never had a client plan that quietly or that precisely for a future he hoped would never arrive. And I sat in that chair, and I thought about Gerald sitting across from Walter 2 years before he died, knowing something about Raymond that he had not told me. And I have spent a great deal of time since then sitting with the complicated feeling of that, because part of me wished he had simply warned me directly, and I understand now that Gerald was trying to protect me without frightening me, and that is a decision made entirely from love, even if it left me exposed in the short term. And if you have ever learned that someone who loved you was quietly carrying a weight they never showed you so that you would not have to carry it, comment "carried it alone," because some people protect you in complete silence, and you only understand the full shape of what they were holding after they are gone. And Sarah opened the envelope carefully, and inside were 3 documents. The first was a notarized letter in Gerald's handwriting, stating clearly that Caldwell's Corner belonged to Dorothy alone, built by Dorothy's vision, sustained by Dorothy's work, and that no member of the Caldwell family, including Raymond, specifically by name, had any moral or legal claim to any portion of the business. And the second was a registered trademark filing Gerald had completed on the name Caldwell's Corner, with Dorothy listed as sole owner. And the third was a separate LLC filing Gerald had quietly structured that made any partnership agreement signed afterward legally contestable on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation, because the LLC operating agreement required full disclosure of all co-ownership arrangements to the sole member before execution, which Raymond had deliberately concealed. And Carol looked at Walter across the desk and said, "This does not win the case automatically, but it makes it very strong." And Walter nodded and said, "We file Monday, and Raymond will have 30 days to respond." And I sat there, holding Gerald's handwriting, and I did not cry. I just pressed my hand flat against the page, the way you press your hand against something real when you need to confirm it is actually there. The next 6 weeks were not easy, and I want to be honest about that, because the story deserves honesty. Raymond did respond through his own attorney and contested the fraud claim and said the partnership agreement had been signed voluntarily and without duress. And there were 2 weeks in that period where Carol called me on a Wednesday evening and said, "Dorothy, I need you to be prepared for the possibility that this takes longer than we hoped."
And I sat on the same stool by the prep station where I had sat when Raymond's offer first came through, and I thought about Gerald, and I thought about the envelope, and I thought about the fact that he had spent 2 years building something precise enough to still be standing after 4 years of silence. And I decided that if Gerald had believed it was enough, then I was going to believe it was enough too. And 3 weeks after the appeal window closed, Raymond's investment arrangement with Tyler quietly dissolved, and I have not heard from either of them since. And I opened Caldwell's Corner the following Monday at 6 sharp, the way I have opened it every single morning for 35 years. Same key, same smell of coffee and butter and something baking in the back. And the only difference was that Sarah was sitting at the corner table with her second cup of coffee, and she looked up when I came through the door and smiled the way Gerald used to smile when I arrived somewhere he had been waiting. And that evening after closing, I sat at the table by the window where Gerald used to drink his second coffee, and I opened his original recipe book to the first page where he had written in his careful handwriting 35 years ago, "Dorothy's kitchen, Gerald's heart, nobody's else's business." And I pressed my hand against the page, and I talked to him the way I have learned to do, and I told him the wall held, and I told him the biscuits were still perfect, and I told him that the corner of Delaney and Fifth still belongs to us, and the kitchen was warm and quiet and completely mine. And for the first time in 4 years, the silence did not feel like absence. It felt like Gerald standing just behind my shoulder, making sure I was okay, the way he always had. And if this story reminded you that the greatest thing someone can love you enough to do is not what they give you while they are here, but what they quietly put in place to protect you after they are gone, comment Gerald's wall. Because some people love you so far into the future that their protection arrives exactly when you need it, even from the other side of goodbye.